I wanted to start with a video that goes into Illustrator, InDesign, and Photoshop a little bit and discuss the differences between the three programs, as well as maybe show a couple shortcuts within each program. So I want to start with Illustrator, and I'm just going to open up the program. And right now I am currently working on some mountain shapes. I use Illustrator most for all of my work. I'm going to go ahead and open up a new document. And in the new document window, you can choose the recent sizes you've used, options for web sizes, print sizes, mobile sizes. So I'm just going to go back to a recent size and open up a letter. I usually change it to inches based on what I'm working with, but there's a lot of different potential units you could work with here in Illustrator. Illustrator is a vector-based program. So what that means is it basically uses the ideas of geometry. It runs off of math concepts to create shapes. So the basic element in Illustrator is a point. I've chosen my pen tool, which is P on the keyboard, and I click to make a point. So I can click multiple times to create any sort of geometric shape. So with your mouse, you just click to create points, and then you can close that up to make a full shape. So again, thinking about geometry, we've got our basic, which is a point. Then we create a line. We can create multiple points that come together to create a shape. Over on the left-hand side, I can choose multiple prefab shapes, as it were. We have rectangles, rounded rectangles, ellipses, polygons, etc. So choosing a rectangle, I can go in and make rectangles pretty easily by clicking and dragging. If I hold Shift on the keyboard, it will get me a square, a perfect square, so all sides are equal. The same thing happens when you choose the ellipse tool. You can create oval shapes, and again, holding down Shift on the keyboard gets you a perfect circle. I chose V on the keyboard to quickly shortcut to my selection tool. And that selection tool is what you use to click and drag to move all of those objects around. There's another tool that is similar. It's called the Direct Select tool. That's A on the keyboard. The Direct Select tool is what you would choose for selecting just a point of the shape. So the selection tool selects the whole object, whereas the Direct Select tool, the A on the keyboard, selects individual points. You can zoom out and zoom in by Control plus or Control minus if you're on a PC, or Command plus or minus if you're on a Mac. So that's a quick overview of Illustrator. So this is again a vector object, and what that means is if you zoom in to the object, there is no loss of quality. So these shapes can be scaled up or down without losing any quality of that object. It's also something that is used for illustration or creating custom graphics. While you can do that in Photoshop, it depends on sometimes where that output is. So that's a little bit about Adobe Illustrator. Further diving into these shapes, I'm going to go ahead and select one of my circles here. Over on the left-hand side is where we can change the color. We also have a couple different palettes over on the right-hand side for color. You'll see I have color up here. The shape that's on the top is indicating the fill color. So white is the fill color. I can drag that off to the side on this kind of work area or pasteboard so that I can see that he does actually have a color inside of him. And maybe we want the fill color to be pink. I can change that on my color sliders on the right hand side, or I could double click on the left hand side in my color picker. So we can get a little bit more control depending on what you're more comfortable with. You can slide it down to maybe a green. The other option is the stroke or the outside color of the object. And again, it's a matter of selecting that stroke, clicking and dragging, or coming over to the color palette and changing the sliders. This particular document is set up as CMYK. You can also have RGB color space, and that's what you want to know what your final output is. So I am just switching back to my little mountain scene here that I'm playing with, and he has, I'm in RGB color space. This object has a black fill and no stroke, so you can also define having no color. We could swap that very easily. I'm going to go over here to this kind of right-angled double-headed arrow on the toolbar and swap those two. Now he has no fill, but he has a stroke of black. So I can drag him over to the pasteboard and see that he really has no fill. This object in the color palette, you can see he only is using one color, black, but we could change that with a potential swatches palette, or there's another color guide section. So there's a lot of ways to deal with color in Illustrator. CMYK or RGB are going to be the two that you choose the most. RGB is for on-screen viewing images, and CMYK is for print objects. And we'll potentially get into color a little bit more down the road. So here are my little shapes that I've drawn. So that is Illustrator. Again, it's vector-based and it has no loss of the shape or the definition of the shape as it were, however large it were to get. So then I'm going to pop into Photoshop. And let's see, let's go ahead and take this image that I was working with a little bit here. So here is, that is actually, oh, there we go. It took a minute for the quality to come up. So I can zoom in and zoom out in Photoshop the same way I did in Illustrator. That can, oh, we've got to, please stand by, let me deselect. I'm moving to the Move tool here just to get off that object that I had selected there for a second. Zooming in is Control plus and minus, and I'm going to zoom all the way in here. So these are pixels, and you've probably heard that term before. It is short for picture element. And this is a fairly high resolution image, meaning it has a lot of pixels per inch, so it has a good quality. And I can go up to image size to see the quality there. So I have 2000 pixels by 800 pixels. And this is a RGB, I'm going to go ahead and say cancel. This is an RGB file, so this is something that would be used for online viewing. You can always switch your two images, you can always switch your image to either of the two different color spaces, CMYK or RGB, depending on your output. So again, this guy can lose quality, unlike vector images. So you want to be sure of where your output is for the images. Photoshop certainly can be used for editing images, and there is a wide range of edit options for healing, patching up, red eye reducing. You can go into the image and crop the image. There's the crop tool, and we can potentially use the rule of thirds here for getting this image right on to a third. There we go. The bear's nose is right on a third. Maybe we'd change that a little bit depending on, oh, I'm not happy with that. There we go. Maybe right there where the bear's eyes would be a nice rule of thirds application. There are multiple selection tools in Photoshop. We have the lasso tool, the polygon lasso tool, the magnetic lasso tool, and those are used to create selection. So maybe I wanted to select this area here, copy and paste it. When you copy and paste, it pastes right in the exact same area. It's created a new layer. We can't see it because it's right on top of itself. So I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, I want to crop it. I've switched to the move tool, and now I can move that piece of landscape to cover my object if I wanted it to. Yeah, I'm going to delete that. There are also plenty of options to paint with here in Photoshop. Some of those options can include brushes. So here's a brush. I have a kind of a tan color selected right now in my foreground. Foreground and background colors look pretty darn similar to what we saw in Illustrator with stroke and fill, but those are really two different concepts, two different types of programs. So Photoshop, because it uses its raster or pixels, I said that wrong. Because it is a program that uses pixels, it is a raster-based program. So that's just another way to say it, raster or bitmapped images, which basically go in and talk about, just another way to talk about pixels. So again, zooming in, we can see all of those sections that are colored in now, all of those pixels that are colored in. Brushes are usually very feathered, so I can see that the red kind of feathers out here at the edge. If I were to click and hold down, there's an option for a pencil, which is a very different tool, which he's kind of going in and filling in very specific pixels. And he's not feathered. So zooming out, it has kind of a chunky feel to it. I'm going to make a new layer. So coming over to my layers palette, over on the left-hand side, there's a little piece of paper with its edge turned up icon, and that is indicative of making a new layer. So I can turn off my layer that I just scribbled on and make a gradient. So this is kind of another way to paint in Photoshop is by using the gradient tool. Coming up to the top, there's a content sensitive or a tool sensitive bar. So I can pick some canned gradients to color with. The longer I click and drag, the wider that gradient's going to be. So that is filling in on my layer 2 that I've created. And because I'm creating new layers, my original image is not being harmed. I could have created colored or brushed or penciled right on top of it, but I didn't. I chose some new layers. So that's a little bit about the difference between Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator. The third piece of the puzzle is InDesign. And the way I like to the way I like to define InDesign is by calling it a container program. So you have hopefully taken a look at the process book a little bit in the way it's set up, and um, I'm going to come back to this guy. I use it as a way to make a catalog for my product. So I'll just quickly show this example here, and then I'll make a new product. So this is, I'll scroll up to the top. Let's use there we go. We're at page 1. I can use my pages palette to scroll between all of my pages. I can double click on a page to jump to that page. So this again is a catalog of mine. I have it set up as a landscape with 5 columns, and I can see those columns in the way my pages are set up with the product views, with the descriptions and prices of the products, and adhering to a grid. This page is still overlapping that 5 column, even though I've broken these images more into a 2-column spread. And I have magnets and ornaments, so I'm still using those columns, even though I'm breaking the grid a little bit here with the moose. I hit W on the keyboard to turn off the guides and grid so that I can see just a plain layout. And then the final page breaks up those 5 columns just a little different. This section is a 1 column, and these are spreading across 4 columns. Again, W on the keyboard. So that is how I typically use InDesign as a container. What I did here, using this again as an example, is all of these images are placed into InDesign. So let me go ahead and make a new document, and we can talk about placing that a little bit further. So InDesign contains images and it contains text. So how I would set this up, I could certainly put guides and grids on a single page, and I do that by going up to Layout, Margins and Columns, and let's go ahead and put 2 columns just here on this first page. Using my Pages palette, I can see that the margins and columns were only applied to that first page. If I wanted to apply let's keep it with 5 columns to all of the pages that I've created, I would change that in the A master. Master pages are where you put information that you want to have on all of your pages. I'm touching on this a little bit. You will certainly look at this more in depth when you get to a multi-page layout class. So I have my A master highlighted, and then I can go to Layout, Margins and Columns again, and let's go ahead and add 5 columns. Coming back down here to page 1, it wasn't applied because I basically overwrote my A master when I applied that 1 column. But looking at all the subsequent pages, I have 5 columns, and I can see that there's a little A here on each one of these pages that indicates that these guys are linked to my A master. If I really wanted page 1 to have those 5 columns, I would want to overwrite that by clicking on A master and dragging it down to page 1. So now he's relinked, so to speak. Maybe on page 3 I didn't want to have any columns, and I could apply no master page to page 3, and his number, or that letter reference to the A master, is taken away. I'll double click to him, and he should be blank, but he's not blank. Let's take a look at none here. On none, aha! If I'm clicking on none, he still has 5 columns. That would be why page 3 still had 5 columns. So let's go to Margins and Columns for none and change that to 1. And now page 3 Should update. There we go. Okay, we're good to go. So everybody is the way I want them to be. So let's go ahead and place an image. So as I mentioned, InDesign is a container. So I'm going to go to File, Place, and maybe I can find that bear that I was just working with. Da, 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 da. There's a bear. Let's just use that bear. Similar bear, different picture. So I go ahead, went File, Place, and then clicked to add this image to the page. He's a large image, and what's happening here is this image was physically not imported. A link was made to this document. So I can see in the links palette that I have the bear image on page 1. If I were to move him to page 2, this would update to page 2 here on the right. And why that's important for links is that it keeps InDesign documents really lightweight and small, while bringing in an image would potentially bloat a document with a really large file size. If I were to go back to that catalog view that I was creating, maybe it's not that one, maybe it's this one, here we go. All of these images would become really, if we were to import all of those images, it would become a really large, unwieldy file. So it makes a link to all of these guys. And see, now we can take a look at my links palette to see all of these guys. And I have something that's missing on page 9. All right, that image is sadly missing. What that means is that I moved this guy into a new folder, and InDesign can't find it. So usually you want to make sure that you have all of your images that you're using for your InDesign document in one place. I typically make an images folder, and move things to that folder, or I misspoke there. I keep all of the files in that one folder, and I try not to move them. You can go and relink. There is an option here to relink, and then it would just be a matter of me trying to figure out where I have moved them. I do have an images folder. Maybe it's in, this is where I would have to do some research on where I potentially put that image. I'm not going to take the time to research it. Maybe it's that one. If it is that one, which it's not, then you would just say open and it would relink. I'm going to go ahead and say cancel. That would be potentially the process of relinking, but I don't know where I put it. So again, it's a container program. It makes links to the documents, to the files of these images. My logo, since we talked about master pages, my logo is potentially on this master page. Yep, there he is. I also have the name and a page number. This is a little reference here, page A, that you can have in a master page that references and updates, so you don't have to put page numbers on all of your pages. Maybe you're doing a 100-page layout. You don't want to put a text box on every page. So that again is something that you'll get to potentially in your multi-page layout to help streamline your work. So back to this little blank guy that we had started. So here's this linked object I've placed in InDesign. InDesign has two boxes that you're working with. It has the frame, and then it has the image. I'm going to switch to the direct select tool. I can move the image around in the frame, or I tend to try to not like to do that. You can change the dimensions of just the frame. So here we go. I'm kind of cropping this down. The image, switching back and forth from the white arrow tool to the black arrow tool, or the selection tool or direct select tool, I am moving that image, and you can see the original size of that image with that kind of brown box. So the frame and the image box are two different things that can move individually or together depending on which tool you have selected. With the direct select tool, you can also change the dimensions of that frame. So here I am selecting that single point just like we did in Illustrator. InDesign does work similarly to Illustrator. It is a vector-based program. So here I've got a weird little trapezoid shape for my for my frame, and then I can still move my image around within that frame. So that works. You can resize the frame by clicking on that bounding box. You can hold down Shift, and again, this is just changing the size of the frame, not the image. If you want to change the image and the frame at the same time, if you want to scale the image and the frame at the same time, it is a different keyboard shortcut. I'm going to go ahead and place a new image, and I'm just working with all of my source images just because it's easy and handy instead of going and finding other stuff. Let's go with cactus. Right now I'm in Tucson, Arizona, where the landscape is all these awesome saguaros and beautiful sunsets. So I want to scale both the frame and the content at the same time. So this guy is a little tricky. You have to, on your keyboard, hold down, and I'm using a Mac, so I'm using Command Shift first on the keyboard, then click on the corner, and so now I'm scaling the image and the frame at the same time. So first it's Shift Command on the keyboard, click and drag with the mouse. If you were to do it at different order, so to speak, first I hit the keyboard, then I did Command Shift, it only scaled the frame. So that's just something to practice with. So let's say we wanted this image to be 3 columns. So Command Shift, click and drag, and now he's at a 3-column width on the page. So again, I mentioned that this is a container. It can also contain type. So I've switched to my text tool, T on the keyboard, and I am going to click and drag to create a text box. You can fill it with real text, or you can go to Type, Fill with Placeholder Text. And this is our wonderful lorem ipsum that we can use as placeholder text. So that's a little bit about all 3 of the programs, a little bit about their differences and how they could potentially be used. One more thing that I wanted to mention about InDesign. I am going to pop back into my catalog and talk, here it is, and talk a little bit about the linking. I had mentioned that we have our links palette, and that I had also had on my A master page my logo. So I have my logo here. It's showing that my logo is in multiple places in this document. It's on page 1, it's on page 10, and it's also on the A master. I can edit this logo. There is a little pencil. So this could be something when you're laying out a poster or your letterhead and you're realizing that something isn't quite right with your file. Hopefully it is quite right, but just in case it isn't, you can hit that pencil button and Illustrator will open, because this is an Illustrator file, and you can edit the original image. I am going to edit this N, and I'm going to make it pretty obvious. I'm going to move him over to the side, And then I'm going to go ahead and save it. And it's thinking and it's saving. There we go. I'm going to go back to InDesign, and when I have saved it in Illustrator, it updates automatically in InDesign. So we can see that wonky little N is now showing up in my document. Really, that's not what I want my brand to be, so I'm going to go back into Illustrator and I am going to undo that, and I'm going to save it. And when we get back to InDesign, it's taken a moment, and if it does take a moment, you will see this little exclamation point saying there is some sort of issue with this document. Sometimes the beauty of the cloud, it works automatically. Sometimes it doesn't. So I can have this image highlighted here in my links palette, and I can go to this update button. It kind of looks like a reload button, and it'll just reload that saved image and it updates automatically. So that's an example of an Illustrator update or a link. Let's go ahead and take a look at an image here. So here is an image, a Photoshop document of this great little hummingbird. Again, I can go in and edit it. Maybe there's just something wrong with it. Ooh, maybe, let's see, what's something that we could do quickly? Let's take our patch tool. Maybe I realized that something is spelled wrong. Maybe I realized that I spelled mountains wrong. It happens to the best of us. I'm going to use my patch tool to make it disappear. And I'm going to, whoop, no, that's me undoing it. I'm going to save it. And then come back to InDesign, and boom, there it is, updated. Again, this isn't really something that I want, so I am going to go back and undo. Undos work a little differently in Illustrator and in Photoshop. Both generally have a large amount of undos that you can do. The best thing for Photoshop is going into the history panel, and it gives you all of the things that you've done to the particular image. So I'm going to go back to where we opened it. There's my text. Great, it's spelled correctly. I'm going to save it again. Now, the one thing is, both in Illustrator and in Photoshop, if I were to have closed this out before going back, all of those changes would not be saved. So just one thing to keep in mind. So I kept that image open because I knew I really didn't want to make those changes. So if I had closed that document, it would have been gone of this guy. And again, even though I hit save, for some reason it's just not updating as quickly. So I'm going to hit that relink, and boom, there's my original image again. So that is something great about the links and editing your images on the fly between all three programs.